So afternoon and welcome everyone to the latest webinar in our foundation series. I'm Stuart Thompson. I work in the construction team at Mills & Reeve. And I'm delighted to be joined by Julie Marshall and Shailee Howard this afternoon. Julie works in our projects team, but also has a lot of experience in the world of procurement. And Shailee, I'm afraid, is an out-and-out procurement lawyer, but don't hold that against her. The topic for this afternoon is procurement in the construction industry in 2021. And we thought it was a topic which is relevant for a number of people, particularly as quite a few things have happened over the past year. The government reissued or issued version 2 of its outsourcing playbook, and that's relevant for the construction sector, particularly those who deal with maintenance and reactive and PPM, so on and so forth. But at the end of last year, the government issued its playbook, and the snappy title Construction Playbook is a bit of a giveaway that is directly relevant for those of us that work in the construction sector and has the potential to change the way in which we procure capital works projects going forwards. And in addition to that, at the same time, the government issued its green paper on procurement generally, as well as a number of PPNs which have been issued by the government too. And when you put all of those together, we think there are things that you need to know about procurement and particularly procurement within our sector. So here's the running order for this afternoon. Julie will lead with the playbook and talk through some of the policies that are set out in the playbook. I'll take over and have a look at some of the procurement approaches which may help to deliver the playbook. And then I'll hand over to Shailee, who will look at the green paper and some of the PPNs in a bit more detail. Before I hand over to Julie, a couple of housekeeping points. One, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available in a couple of days or so. And the second housekeeping point, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function within Zoom, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can at the end of the session itself. So, Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. So next slide, please. As Stuart mentioned, the Construction Playbook came in December 2020. It applies to all new construction projects and programmes from December 2020, and it's mandatory for central government departments, their executive agencies and non-departmental public bodies on a comply or explain basis. In addition, the wider public sector is encouraged to take account of it in their projects. The playbook does recognise that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to public works, and the principles, policies in the playbook are to be applied proportionately. Where planning for projects has already started, or an authority is using an existing framework agreement, they're told to take a pragmatic approach to embedding the playbook. Next slide, please. The playbook refers to 3 cross-cutting priorities, and these are health, safety and well-being, and this is in terms of the construction workforce, and it encourages embedding CDM regulations. Building safety is the next one. Obviously, following the Grenfell tragedy, this is a key issue. The next one is building back greener, and there's a focus on sustainability and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, there's an emphasis in the playbook on social value, which Shailee will talk about in a little while, value for money, improved outcomes, fair profit and sustainability of the sector, and adopting a collaborative approach, and that's between both contracting authorities themselves and also between contracting authorities and the private sector. Next slide, please. So as you probably know, there are about 80 pages to the Construction Playbook. So obviously on today's session, we'll just be providing a summary of the key issues. What I'll be doing this afternoon is referring to the 5 stages of a procurement that are set out in the playbook, and those also include various typical activities within those stages. And then I'll be talking about the 14 key policies that should be applied throughout a construction procurement. So starting with the 5 key stages, we'll start with stage 1, which is the preparation and planning stage. And the typical activities listed here are to develop a clear definition of business need, to articulate value drivers and desired outcomes, to assess the market in terms of capacity and capability, to carry out pre-procurement consultation of the market, to ensure early supply chain involvement, and this is not just tier 1 but also tiers 2 and 3, to develop a sourcing strategy, and to start to draft and prepare the specification, tender documents and contract, and using feedback from the pre-procurement consultation with the market when designing these. Next slide, please. So stage 2 is the publication stage, and the key activities here are to prepare the procurement documentation and to advertise the contract opportunity. Stage 3 is the selection stage, and the key activities listed in the playbook here are early supply chain involvement, or ESI, and adopting an outcome-based approach. Next slide, please. Stage 4 is the evaluation and award stage, and that involves evaluating the tenders, notifying the bidders of the award decision, signing the contract and publishing the award decision. Stage 5 is the final stage of the procurement, and that's the contract implementation stage. And this involves managing and monitoring the execution of the construction, dealing with any modifications, obviously always having regard to Regulation 72 of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015, which govern modifications, closing the contract and moving to the operational stage, and carrying out operation review and benefit realisation. And this includes collecting and sharing robust data and considering lessons learned. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'll be going through the 14 key policies that are to be considered throughout the procurement and project lifecycle. The playbook does list these under the individual stages of a procurement, and I've done so in the next few slides. And I've colour-coded them to match the colour coding in the playbook, and apologies to anybody who is colourblind like my husband, and I hope you can read them easily. So the first stage is preparation and planning, and the first key policy here is to develop and publish commercial pipelines, and this is to ensure wider participation, particularly from SMEs. Contracting authorities are required to publish their own commercial pipelines, and these will be supported by new central government procurement pipelines, which will be published too. Key policy number 2 is to carry out market health and capability assessments, and this is to identify opportunities and limitations to increase competition, market health and value for money. Key policy number 3 is for authorities to consider aggregating projects and developing project portfolios, and to consider longer term contracting. And standardised designs and longer term contracts are to encourage greater investment and efficiency. However, the playbook does recognise that this should be balanced against the need for innovation and maintaining competition, and particularly in terms of SMEs who might suffer as a result of longer term contracting. However, measures are suggested within the playbook for dealing with that. And when setting and developing KPIs, authorities should consider things like ensuring continuous improvement is embedded into those. Key policy number 4 is to harmonise digitalise and rationalise demand, with authorities sharing requirements, having digitalised common standards and specifications, and making maximum use of modern methods of construction and off-site manufacturing. Key Policy 5 is to further embed digital technologies, and contracting authorities should apply the BIM framework and consider digital twins. Key Policy number 6 is the early supply chain involvement, one I mentioned earlier on, and authorities should discuss options and the approach to the procurement and contract in order to reduce issues further downstream. Next slide, please. Key Policy number 7 is for authorities to adopt an outcome-based approach. And this should be focusing on whole life value, not on just the construction cost. It should be focused on the whole life value, performance and cost. The Cabinet Office is developing a new project scorecard, which will be published in due course. And when preparing KPIs, these should be based on an outcome-based approach, and authorities should have regard to the government transparency agenda, which requires the publication of key KPIs. Key Policy number 8 is to carry out benchmarking and develop should-cost models. And this is to analyse information from past projects. And it's considered that the should-cost models should lead to a better understanding of whole life costs and value. Key Policy number 9 is the preparation of delivery model assessments, considering the most appropriate structure for a project in order to deliver best outcomes. The last one under the preparation stage is effective contracting, and contracts should be structured in order to support data exchange, greater collaboration, improved value, improved risk management, and continuous improvement. In the publication stage, there are 2 key policies. Number 11, the first is risk allocation. This will be subject to Cabinet Office scrutiny. The playbook mentions that risk allocation should be discussed in the market engagement exercise, and it's considered that appropriate risk allocation will lead to more attractive procurements, greater competition, value for money, and a focus on agreed outcomes. Key Policy number 12 is the payment mechanism and pricing approach. Again, this will be subject to Cabinet Office scrutiny, and they should be designed in order to incentivise desired behaviours and outcomes. Next slide, please. In the selection stage, there's just 1 key policy, which is assessing the economic and financial standing of suppliers, applying a minimum standard. And when setting and assessing economic and financial standing criteria, authorities should comply with the general principles of transparency, proportionality, equal treatment, fair competition, and non-discrimination. The last key policy is in the evaluation and award stage and is resolution planning. And this arises out of the collapse of Carillion. So suppliers of critical public works contracts are to be required to provide resolution planning information to authorities. And this includes things like service continuity plans, which deal with a scenario where the contractor becomes insolvent. In addition, authorities should develop their own contingency plans and consider risk mitigation strategies, such as requiring guarantees or bonds, and carry out ongoing financial monitoring. Again, when setting any such requirements, authorities should make sure that they are proportional. Whilst these aren't actually key policies in the playbook does mention evaluation criteria, where these should be focused on whole life cost, not just the construction cost. Value should be prioritised over cost, and value can include issues such as health and safety and social value, which should have a minimum 10% weighting, which, as I said, Shailee will be talking about a bit more shortly, and ensuring net zero GHG emissions. One other final thing that the playbook mentions is abnormally low bids, and the playbook requires authorities to refer abnormally low bids, that is, ones that are more than 10% below the average of all the bids received, to the Cabinet Office prior to accepting any such bids. So that was a quick run through of the key policies and the stages. I'll now hand over to Stuart, who will talk about procurement approaches.
Thanks very much, Julie. Hopefully I'm off mute. Thumbs up if I am. Thank you. Loads of good stuff in the playbook, full of buzzwords such as MMC, collaboration, early supplier engagement, and whole life costing. And the government has decided to summarise all of its key buzzwords into a whizzy strapline, which is better, faster, greener. I'm not sure about you, but I think we have come across this strapline in a slightly different form a few times before. Latham sort of referred to it back in '94, and certainly when you look at the Construction 2025 plan that was published back in '13, some of the three key elements, lower costs by 33%, faster delivery by half, lower emissions by half, sound very similar to better, faster and greener. Construction 2025 didn't quite succeed as the government had hoped. So why is it now that the playbook has come back to the fore, and will it be a success where Construction 2025 didn't quite meet the outcomes that everyone expected? So to answer that, I think there are three areas that we ought to look at. They deal with technology and data, ESG, and also mindset and procurement. And it's the third one that I'm going to look at first. And what do I mean by mindset? Well, here's a diagram of a traditional way in which clients have procured construction projects in the past. You tend to have two teams, the design team on one side, the contractor team on the other, team A, team B. It develops an us and them mentality. And particularly with single stage procurement, where you do have this two-team concept, the design team hands over the designs to the contractor, and the contractor then builds out. The aspiration is that the final outturn cost is close to the pre-tender estimate. But in practice, I'm sure many of you who are on this webinar have been involved in final account discussions with a contractor, some of you possibly in adjudication, and maybe a few of you in tribunals. But we see, particularly with single stage procurement, that the pre-tender estimate is an aspiration and the final outturn cost is much greater than the pre-tender estimate set by part of the design team at the beginning of a project. So why is that? There are a number of reasons why the outturn cost goes up, and invariably it's due to program pressure, and by that I mean project program pressure. The design team is up against it, planning takes a little bit longer than everyone expected, designs are incomplete, and it hands over a slightly incomplete package to the contractor. The contractor doesn't have that long to undertake its own due diligence on the designs, builds in assumptions into its price, and when the contractor is on site, a number of those assumptions go live and the price goes up, or there is a discussion with the design team and the employer about who takes the risk for certain unforeseen events when the contractor is on site. And when you have a tussle on site, invariably the program slips, and if the program slips, the cost goes up. So approach one doesn't seem to fit in with the BFG, the better, faster, greener approach that is set out within the playbook. Approach two may help a little bit. Approach two is a two-stage process that again has been around for a long time, and I'm sure a number of you on the webinar have used two-stage procurements. It gives the contractor a little bit more time to investigate designs and some of the technical documents, because the contractor is involved at the end of Reeve stage 3. However, in our experience, it still doesn't assist the contractor an awful lot. because although it can agree the contract sum having undertaken a little bit of DD before signing the contract, by the time the contractor becomes involved, those designs have already been baked in by the design team. They tend to be wedded to their design philosophy, and they don't tend to listen to the contractor's good ideas at the outset. So you always, in our view, start to see a bit of tussle on site, even with the two-stage approach. So to deal with those sorts of issues, in recent years, we've seen a new approach come to the fore, which is the three-stage procurement. And by that, I mean that contractors are involved earlier on in the design process. They become involved partway during stage 2 or at the end of stage 2. And because they are involved at an earlier stage, it gives everyone more time to undertake DD, but also, importantly, the contractor has more time to have an input into the development of the design before it's finalised by the design team. It also has an opportunity to engage with its supply chain and get the good ideas from specialist subcontractors and feed those through to the design team as well. And anecdotally, the feedback that we have had from clients is this three-stage approach, by having the contractor involved at an earlier stage, does seem to help in terms of program pressure, but also cost. And this is where we start to see possibly an approach which will fit in with the aspirations set out within the playbook. So if early contractor engagement is something that may work for delivering the elements that Julie has referred to before, can you take it a stage further? And the answer to that is you can. And by that I mean approach 4. And approach 4 is a supercharged, very early contractor engagement. In essence, you have a single delivery team working towards a common set of goals, having an input at the outset to all design decisions, undertaking risk reviews at the outset to ensure that the client is fully informed as to how the project may develop. And because the contractor is involved right at the start, it gives everyone an opportunity to maximize ideas about construction technology, innovation around green tech, and sharing of data and collaboration. So it's a model which could successfully deliver BFG. And although the playbook doesn't set out which procurement approach it would prefer, when you look at the language within the playbook, there is a suggestion that this integrated delivery model might be the one that the government has in mind. That's great, but in our experience, it's the rarest procurement approach that you see on a day-to-day basis. It's the one that requires most effort, not only from the client team, but also from the design team and the contractor team. And it takes a lot of upfront investment in time and a little bit of money to make sure that the integrated model is a success from the start. And that's why you tend to see this model being used on very large infrastructure projects. And you don't tend to see it on the more day-to-day projects that most of us are probably involved in more often than not. So it might be that there are some challenges for the industry to deliver the playbook if the government wants us to use approach 4. So are we ready for collaboration generally? Are we ready for the integrated model going forwards? As I've alluded to just previously, it might be okay for large projects, but I'm not sure that it is best suited for more of the standard projects that certainly we are involved in and no doubt come across your desk on a more day-to-day basis. And the reason for that is that notwithstanding the government's push for collaboration, as a sector, we are still set up for the two-team model. It's more often than not that the design team is involved in a project far earlier and becomes entrenched far sooner than the contractor becomes involved. There is still an appetite for the race to the bottom for a number of clients. There's a lot of price pressure, notwithstanding the aspirations set out within the playbook that Julie has referred to about whole life costing. And although there is an appetite for early contractor engagement, there's not a high appetite for early contractor engagement in our experience. So how are we going to deal with this particular challenge? In some ways, we're going to be forced to deal with it. As Julie alluded to, the playbook is mandatory for government departments. There is a sense that they will strongly encourage contracting authorities to engage with the playbook, even though it's not mandatory. And when you read the playbook, it's full of terms such as collaboration, early supply chain involvement, having a partnership model which has an appropriate risk allocation. And there's a reference there to the PPC 2000, which is a standard form contract, does promote collaboration. So are there examples where approach 4 does work and can work? And can we share some of the experiences where it has succeeded and use those going forwards? The answer to that is yes, there are examples where government departments have successfully embraced the collaboration model, and they include the MOJ in the rail sector, the road sector as well as social housing, and a number of local authorities have an integrated model when they're delivering school programs and other programs within their authorities. And they're delivered through either a clever use of frameworks which they've set up, or by having a partnering contract such as the PPC 2000 or an alliancing contract too. So there are elements out there where we can draw on to use the experiences and the best practice developed by other government departments to ensure that some of the good bits from approach 4 are used by people other than large government departments. So moving on to the second area, which is technology. And again, are we ready to embrace technology as a sector? And historically, Julie has referred to data sharing as being something set out within the playbook. Historically, we haven't been great at that. Designers like to hold on to stuff and only begrudgingly give it over to contractors. And there are even cases where certain consultants have held on to BIM data until they've been paid by clients, etc. And similarly with construction tech, we've been slow as a sector to embrace technology and how we can use it to improve the way in which we deliver capital projects. Tech has been expensive. There hasn't been a huge amount of experience in using it historically, and that's something as a sector that we'll have to get over if we are to successfully deliver the playbook. So is there a way forward on tech? It's the same issue. We're going to have to get used to it. A nudge and a shove from the playbook. You read what the playbook is saying. It's encouraging MMC, standardization, BIM, the BIM framework, and the use of digital twin. So if that's the way that government wants us to go, do we have to only use approach 4 to successfully adopt technology? To look at that, if I take us back to approach 1, where it's possibly the most adversarial way in which you could procure a construction capital works project going forwards, this idea of having 2 teams. And it is or can be adversarial because of the way in which the data is handed over to the contractor just before the contractor is asked to sign the contract. And because the contractor doesn't have time to review the data in detail, that's where you have more surprises on site, and that's why the price invariably tends to go up. But I think the timing is right for the playbook, and by that I mean that we are now used to dealing with technology. We've been doing it for a while. Digital twin, there's lots of experience within the sector of successfully embracing that. Similarly, MMC, it's been a buzzword for a few years. There's so much investment going into MMC, and particularly off-site manufacturing and the standardization of various elements of capital works projects, that will help in terms of sharing data with the contractor and other elements of the design team. And because tech has already been or is becoming more and more prevalent, tech helps us to iron out the wrinkles within design documents. Tech helps us to speed up issues to the extent they arise on site, so that there should be fewer issues when the contractor starts on site. And when the contractor does start on site, those issues can be dealt with more quickly and effectively than perhaps they could have been when the Construction 2025 plan was developed back in 2013. So although approach 4 seems to be the one that fits closest with the aspirations of the playbook, it's possible, in our view, to use approach 1 successfully because of the way in which tech has developed over the past few years. And that's something to bear in mind when you are thinking about taking the good bits from the playbook and introducing them into your own procurements. The final hurdle is around ESG, and historically, rather than embracing environmental solutions, thinking about social value and governance, because of program pressure and budgetary pressure, value engineering is the thing that most people tend to think about rather than building in additional cost to deal with green tech. So again, are we ready to embrace ESG? And here I think that the playbook itself is the beneficiary of timing. And by that I mean that back in 2018, after the events at Grenfell Tower, Dame Hackett made it absolutely clear that the race to the bottom is a broken model, and we should move away from that and embrace a way of procuring safe and better construction projects going forwards. Yesterday, Sunak in the budget alluded to green tech, possibly didn't go as far as most people were expecting, but there was a reference there to the Bank of England taking into account green tech going forwards, as well as this idea of a green gilt. And there was a reference to the new bank that's going to be set up in Leeds. Other elements that will help us deliver ESG, again, the playbook itself makes it absolutely clear that the idea of the race to the bottom, we should park that to one side to the extent we can and look at whole life costing, value-based procurements, and focus on value and not cost, as well as this idea of net zero and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So which approach works for delivering ESG? Shock horror. It doesn't have to be approach 4 in our view. Given that green tech is moving on a pace, the amount of R&D that's going into green tech is bringing the price down. It can be assimilated into the procurement very early on. And if it is assimilated into the procurement very early on, then this is another element that can be delivered outside of the approach 4. I've included approach 2 here, but I could quite easily have put in approaches 1 or 3. And moving on to my final summary slide, which approach will deliver BFG? If it's right for you, then the integrated model, the integrated approach is absolutely fine. However, that approach may not be appropriate for all of you who are on this webinar. And it's likely that because of technology and the way in which that has developed over recent years, approaches 1, 2, and 3 can be used as well to deliver the good bits within the playbook in procurements going forwards. One final rain cloud moment before I hand over to Shailee is that I've looked at procurement approaches and how they can help to deliver the playbook. However, one other area that we ought to think about are skill shortages within our sector. There's still an issue to grapple with there, encouraging young people to join the construction industry and to embrace that as a career opportunity. Nothing really within the playbook, possibly a little bit around social value. That's an area going forwards that the government should look at, as well as addressing issues regarding capacity within the sector itself and possibly fine-tuning the planning system to reduce some of the delays which are caused at the outset. So I'll hand over to Shailee, who will talk through some of the issues arising out of the Green Book and PPNs. Shailee.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi, everyone. I'm going to spend the last section of our webinar talking about the Green Paper that was published in December last year, as well as some of the PPNs that will impact on procurements that you're either running or bidding on this year. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I think it's fair to say there's quite a lot of criticism of the public procurement regime. It's overly complex, it's cumbersome, it's slow, it does get sort of quite negative press. And what the forward to the Green Paper says is that Brexit provides an opportunity to really shake up the rules and make them simpler, easier to navigate, drive innovation and achieve the best outcomes, which is very much aligned to the sort of the tone of the construction and the outsourcing playbooks. So very lofty ambitions, but it remains to be seen whether the proposals that come out of the Green Paper can actually achieve that. Before we delve into the detail of the Green Paper, it's also worth remembering that the government remains a member of the World Trade Organization's Government Procurement Agreement and also has lots of other bilateral trade agreements that cover public procurement. And what that means is that the UK can't sort of rip up the rule book on procurement as much as it might like to. There's still an obligation to ensure access to our contracts on an international basis. So the Green Paper itself is split into 8 chapters. And what the Cabinet Office has said is that they've really focused on the things that they want to change. So there will be things within the current regime that will stay. So, for example, some contracts between public authorities are exempt, and our understanding from the Cabinet Office is that that won't change significantly. But I think there are things that could do with clarification that aren't addressed. So, for example, the classic question of whether a works contract are all works contracts covered by public procurement. You know, there's always issues around sort of development agreements falling on the right or wrong side of the line. And also there doesn't appear to be any change to the definition of contracting authorities. And I know that's something that a lot of our university clients, for example, would welcome clarity on. The Green Paper asks for responses back by 10th of March, which is next week. So if you do have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to share, please do so. We are preparing a response to the Green Paper and we'll be happy to share your views on a no-names basis, of course. So let's start by looking at the first chapter. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. And what this does is articulate the principles of procurement. So they're up there on the slide. We've already got this in some way in Regulation 18 of the current procurement rules. But now that we are out of the EU, the UK government is using this opportunity to really update them to reflect the UK's change in approach. It won't be a legal obligation as far as we know so far. The Cabinet Office says they're really to be used as a guide or a mental checklist for authorities and also to help review bodies when they're interpreting the legislation. So not all of these principles will be mandatory or will apply in every case. The inclusion of the public good is an interesting departure and it seems to go beyond the sorts of principles that we're all familiar with. It could potentially lead to sort of arguments between lawyers about what the public good actually means in the context of a procurement. So as well as the procurement principles, we've also got a new National Procurement Policy Statement, or NPPS. This is actually a separate initiative to the Green Paper, but it is relevant and it is aligned to the principles we've talked about. The government's going to set up plans to require authorities to have regard to the NPPS, and it quotes things like the outsourcing and construction playbook, so publishing pipelines and all the things that Julie's talked about. And that could really potentially place quite a huge burden on authorities And thinking about sort of what the forward of the Green Paper says around alleviating pressure, I think there are some instances where the Green Paper potentially adds more of a burden in terms of the work that's required when running a procurement process. Next up is the changes to the amount of rules you need to look at. So there's something like 450 regulations across the public utilities, concessions and defence procurement regulations. And the idea is that we would have one set going forward, but sector-specific features would be retained. But that's not to say we'd have one rule book entirely. So the PPNs, the policy procurement notes that the Cabinet Office publishes, as well as case law, as well as the NPPS, they will all still be relevant. So looking at the procedures, the Green Paper proposes that we go from 7 procedures down to 3, and authorities will have flexibility to design a process that's bespoke to their procurement. So no changes to the minimum timescales, those are enshrined in the Government Procurement Agreement, but the idea is that the flexibility saves time. So no changes to the open procedure. The competitive flexible procedure works on the basis that the selection stage is relatively straightforward, and then authorities have the freedom to design the tendering stage in a way that suits their particular procurement. The potential issue is that you've potentially got bidders responding to a myriad of slightly different competitive flexible procedures. So bidders will need to be as equally flexible when they're responding to competitive flexible procedures. And so query whether this overall makes the process simpler. The limited tendering procedure is effectively the negotiated procedure without advert, or grounds for direct award in sort of non-procurement speak. The grounds will stay roughly the same, but with the addition of procurement in a crisis. So government's clearly thinking about another pandemic, perish the thought. Next, we've got evaluation. I wanted to mention the amendment to the grounds for exclusion, but also a proposal to create a central debarment list, so that authorities can quickly and easily see whether a bidder has been excluded from participation in public procurement. I think that would help in terms of ensuring consistency when bidders are excluded, but seems to be quite a huge undertaking and would be quite complex to set up. And the system would also need to ensure that suppliers from outside of the UK would be listed too. Just move on to the next slide. There are changes proposed to dynamic purchasing systems and framework agreements. So there's the concept of a DPS plus, which can be used for all types of procurements and not just commonly used goods and services. And there's also a proposal that there'll be 2 options for framework agreements. You've got the sort of traditional closed framework of 4 years. That's once suppliers are on it, that's it for 4 years. And then you've got the option of an open framework, which has a maximum duration of 8 years and are open to new suppliers at defined points in time. And contracting authorities will be permitted to limit the number of suppliers on the framework at any one time. But if that option is chosen, then the authority will have to re-evaluate bids of suppliers on the framework alongside the new suppliers every time they open up that joining point. So I think it's a good idea, but possibly quite tricky to keep track of when frameworks are up for being reopened. And I suppose the other issue with framework agreements is that often by the end of the 4 years they have potentially become obsolete because the world's moved on and the requirements might be quite different. And I think that's definitely the case if you've got a framework for potentially for 8 years. The next one I wanted to talk about was open and transparent contracting, and I think the Green Paper suggests quite a fundamental change in this area. In order to maximise transparency, authorities will be required to publish information on a procurement as it progresses through a procurement life cycle. So starting from the identity of the bidders, the selection process, the basis of the award decision, as well as evaluation report. So all that information that you're required to keep is uploaded and available to see. And that will be retained and published on a central register. And the intention is to require authorities to undertake a fully electronic procedure which complies with the Open Contracting Data Standard. I'd only recommend looking at that and Googling it if you are sort of computer minded, because it does seem to sort of descend into code, I think, quite easily. But it's quite a dramatic change, I think, that's proposed by the Green Paper and potentially one of the hardest to achieve across the whole of the public sector. Next, you've got procurement challenges. So the proposals say that there's potentially going to be a tailored expedited process for procurement claims and possibly the use of a tribunal for lower value claims. There will be a cap on the damages that are available to legal fees and 1.5 times bid costs. And there'll also be the removal of automatic suspensions where a contract is procured urgently, sort of in extreme emergency situations or in a crisis. Linked to the proposals around open contracting, there's also changes proposed to the debriefing process. So the proposal is that individual debrief letters or standstill letters will be removed, because the idea is that all debrief information will be provided on this sort of central platform. So there's no obligation to draft individual standstill letters, which I think, if adopted, will come as sort of good news to authority procurement teams. So this really does propose quite a significant change to the current approach, and really does depend on authorities putting good quality debriefing information on the central platform. And I think if not, then we could see sort of a spike in complaints from bidders. Prompt payment continues to be a key feature of the government's policy on procurement, and I'll talk about a sort of PPN that applies from April shortly. But what the Green Paper says is that they'd like to introduce new rules that will contain mechanisms that allow authorities to enforce prompt payment terms. There's also an aspiration to align private and public sector reporting requirements. It's not entirely clear how this will be implemented, but the idea is that all payment performance will be in one place, which will allow greater scrutiny. Finally, we have contract modifications. Not much changes proposed. Authorities will still be able to modify in certain scenarios. The only notable change is that a contract amendment notice will be required in all cases. So that's the Green Paper. I think it's fair to say it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think there are some changes that will be welcomed across both the public and the private sector, but others that are quite light on detail, so quite tricky at this point to see exactly how they'll work in practice. There's a long way to go before any of these proposals become law. We'll await the response to the Green Paper, and then draft legislation will be proposed. In the meantime, there are some changes that have been made following Brexit. You can watch our webinar by clicking on the link, and that talks you through some of the changes made immediately after Brexit. As Stuart mentioned at the start, there are a handful of PPNs that implement changes now. I'll talk briefly about social value. That's been mentioned a few times and features in the Construction Playbook too. If we can move on to the next slide. So it does apply to central government, their exec agencies and NDPBs, but I think it's equally of interest to other authorities as well. What it does is it sets out a social value model that's to be applied in procurements where social value is relevant and proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. Before this, there was an obligation under the Public Services Social Value Act to consider evaluating social value, but this PPN goes a lot further and makes application of the social value model mandatory. There's a list of themes and outcomes to apply. So, for example, recovering from COVID is one. Other policy outcomes are fighting climate change, addressing workforce inequality, and improving health and well-being. So really lots of crossover with the themes and policies that we've seen in the Construction Playbook. The social value model mandates a minimum weighting of 10%, and that's to the overall score and not just the quality criteria. And it's open to authorities to apply a higher weighting if they can justify it. And as with any sort of evaluation model, it's really important that the authority stress tests the methodology to ensure that the relative weightings given to each criterion don't lead to any unintended consequences. So it's worth a read of the social value model. There's lots of model evaluation questions, criteria, and reporting metrics for each of the policy outcomes. So a lot of the hard work has been done already. So quite useful if you're really considering how to sort of meaningfully evaluate social value in your procurements, and equally of value to bidders who might want to familiarise themselves with some of the questions in preparation for forthcoming procurements. I'll just mention briefly PPN 11, and this is in relation to below threshold contracts. It allows the authorities listed on the slide to limit the scope of a procurement to invite either suppliers by their location or by SMEs or VCSEs. So this policy is designed to help authorities tackle economic inequality, create new businesses or jobs, and really encourage new entrants to the public market. It's not an absolute obligation to always limit below threshold contracts. You've still got to consider what achieves the best value for money. And again, the audit trail is key. There is a template document that helps authorities record their rationale for reserving procurements. Just one more point from me on PPN 7. So this will apply to procurements with an annual contract value of 5 million from April. The PPN introduces a new standard question to be included in the selection questionnaire, assessing bidders' payment systems and their payment performance. Again, so I think this is designed to implement the government's objective of encouraging a healthy cash flow by mandating prompt payment through the supply chain. And bidders will be asked in the standard question to self-certify that they meet the required standards, and that's to be evaluated on a pass-fail basis. We have been promised an updated standard selection questionnaire by the Cabinet Office, which will have these questions included, so watch out for that. So that's all from me. I think I'll hand back to Stuart now.
Thank you, Shailee. Time to draw breath, loads to take in. Just looking at the questions and time, as ever, lawyers, we thought we'd take half an hour. We've taken nearly an hour, so apologies for that. Julie, there's a question here regarding the playbook and how it will work with existing frameworks and call-offs under those frameworks. Is that something that you can assist with?
Yeah. I mean, it is that is a good question, because it is a potential issue, and the playbook does recognise that it's a potential issue, which is why they say if you're calling off under an existing framework agreement, that you need to take a pragmatic approach. So still try and apply the principles as much as you can, apply the playbook as much as you can, but recognising that there are constraints, because you're doing it under an existing framework agreement with contract terms and call-off process that are already set. Having said that, a lot of frameworks, a lot of CCS frameworks have a fair bit of flexibility in terms of the contract and the call-off process. So I think there is quite a good bit of scope there to embed parts of the playbook and some of those key policies. So I think that you know, it's certainly something that can be done to a certain extent. Going forward, the Cabinet Office says in the playbook that they will be updating CCS frameworks, so that the new frameworks that come out in the future will embed the playbook properly, so that all the principles can be applied in all the call-offs under it. Yeah, so I think you know, obviously slightly limited scope to introduce the playbook completely at the moment, but you know, there is flexibility, and going forward it should be much easier.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
And Shailee, you thought you were finished, but I'm afraid the social value PPN, there's a question here. Are there any exceptions to that 10% minimum weighting rule?
Sort of. What the guidance says is that you've got to have this minimum 10% of the overall weighting, and we talked a bit about how that could be sort of tricky. And the point of that is that it sends a message to the market that social value is really important to the contracting authority, and it ought to make a difference really in terms of the decision to award the contract. There is one exception set out in the guidance to the social value model, and that's where an authority has undertaken pre-market engagement, and they've found that actually having 10% apportioned to social value would actually reduce competition, because the market isn't quite mature enough in delivering social value, but that really is an exceptional case, and if you've got that scenario, then it might be permissible to apportion 10% within the quality score. But other than that, I think the answer is not really many exceptions. I think it would be interesting to see how this plays out, because I think certainly our experience is that authorities are struggling to sort of fit in the 10% for social value with their sort of big procurements, alongside all the other things that they want to make sure they're meaningfully evaluating.
Okay. Conscious of time, there's a quick question for me. Which approach is likely to succeed? Probably approach 3. I think if I were to put my house on something, and I had to put my house on something, I think approach 3, having some degree of early contractor involvement, is helpful for everyone. Possibly going down the approach 4 route, maybe a step too far, and with the use of tech, etc. I think having approach 3, we're ripe to develop that as a way of procuring capital works projects going forwards. But we'll wait to see how the playbook develops, and particularly how some of the terms in the playbook are adopted by our sector. What do we mean by whole life cost? It's a generic term. What do we mean by net zero? It's a generic term, and it'll be interesting to see how much detail is put around those terms going forwards. So I'm contractually obliged to plug upcoming webinars, and there are 3 dates for your diary. At the end of this month, there's one on taxation in the industry. Loads going on about taxation in the construction sector, things coming into effect this year and also next year. After Easter, just before the May holiday, we're delighted that Professor Sean Smith from the University of Edinburgh will join us to tell us what we mean by net zero and how we can build towards that. And in May, as ever, payment and insolvency in the construction industry never goes away, remains an important topic, and Alexandra Pike from the construction team will lead us through that with a restructure specialist, Neil Smith, from our insolvency team. So dates for your diary. I'm still contractually obliged to remind everyone that there will be feedback as and when we sign off from the webinar, and please also sign up to the Construction and Engineering LinkedIn page, and I believe that's also will be sent out to you, as well as the procurement portal that has loads of good stuff from our procurement team. So thank you very much for attending, and have a good rest of the day.